We are honored to have Commissioner Gottlieb here with us today. After his remarks, he will be joined on stage for a Q&A discussion with AdvaMed CEO and President Scott Whitaker. Ladies and gentlemen, FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb.
Thanks for the nice introduction, Brian. I appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I want to let you know how much I appreciate the chance to share with you some of the steps that FDA is taking when it comes to advancing the agency's public health agenda with respect to our medical device program. Before I begin today, I'd like to just share with you a few thoughts regarding the recent hurricanes. FDA has been engaged in the relief effort from all of the recent disasters. We've been working closely with the citizens of Texas and Florida to help farmers and other agricultural producers in their recovery efforts. We've also worked closely with medical product developers in each state who've been impacted by these events. But over the last week, we've been especially active with the events unfolding in Puerto Rico. As you know, FDA has a lot of agency personnel on the island. Puerto Rico has long been home to many manufacturing sites of FDA-regulated products, including medical devices. The island's medical product manufacturing base is an important part of its economic foundation, and that industrial base has been a key part of the island's ongoing economic recovery before this devastating storm. At FDA, we're doing everything we can to support our own personnel, as well as help our fellow citizens who live on the island. We're also assisting the facilities that we oversee to get finished goods off the island and help the local manufacturing sites get back online. We want to mitigate any potential shortages that could result from supply disruptions. Our top goal is to support the people as they deal with the aftermath of this devastating hurricane. My senior team and I have been personally engaged in this effort since the storm struck and before. I can tell you from my discussions, the situation down there is very serious. I'm trying to plan a personal trip to the island along with colleagues from the Department of Homeland Security who've been leading many of the recovery efforts and who we've been in close coordination with directly. They've been invaluable and very close partners to FDA through this entire episode. And I know that we will all keep our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico in our thoughts as they begin a long and very hard recovery that lies ahead. I look forward to the discussions that will follow my brief remarks today. I want to share some thoughts with you about FDA's medical device program and the new initiatives we're working on. And there's one bottom line that I want to stress above all else, and it's this. Some of the most creative and forward-leaning advances in regulatory policy are what we're doing on the medical device side of FDA's house. I want to share with you why I see things this way, and I want to share what some of the new steps are that we're going to be taking. But I want to frame these thoughts with an anecdote that came up last week in my travels. I spoke last week at a conference on the use of real-world evidence in support of medical product development. It was a conference sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences. A lot of the conference discussion focused on new drug development, but the bottom line is that all the ideas and initiatives that I was discussing in relation to new drugs on the hope that these concepts could be put into practice are already a key element of our approach to medical device development and the program at FDA. Last month, we issued a final guidance on the use of real-world evidence in the development of devices, and since early 2015 alone, we've approved or cleared more than 8 new medical devices and expanded the use of more than 6 technologies based on evidence derived from real-world evidence. This includes drug-eluting stents, transcatheter heart valves, and technologies for spinal cord stimulation and esophageal atresia, as well as IVDs, just to mention a few. And in these cases, we're using robust evidence that was generated in less time and at lower cost than in the past, in some cases saving 1 or 2 years of development time. Increasingly, medical device makers are also meeting their post-market commitments using constructs from RWA. These policy advances, first engineered in CDRH, are going to go viral at FDA. For example, the definitions and standards that we've developed in a guidance document that initially focused on medical devices I spoke about are being incorporated into an agency-wide policy right now. This new policy statement will apply to all medical products. The FDA's consensus standard for how we describe real-world evidence are going to be the map that we use for medical products across the entire agency. There are other similar anecdotes that I could walk through. The bottom line is that for a combination of reasons, we've been able to advance new policy and regulatory concepts in the context of medical devices that can take more time to firm up in other areas. There are some obvious reasons for this. The first is that devices are often tools in the hands of providers, and the process for innovation when it comes to devices is more iterative. Devices are constantly being adapted and improved based on feedback from the end users and their performance in clinical practice. This iterative process for innovation lends itself to modern constructs for collecting and making use of data, like the use of real-world evidence, or the use of prospective registries or statistical frameworks that improve the reliability of practical data. At the same time, the statute that governs medical devices is based on a more modern approach to medical product regulation. It gives FDA explicit direction to adjust the scope of its requirements based on risk. The essence of this framework gives FDA very explicit direction to require different levels of evidence as a condition of pre-market clearance or approval, whether it's a PMA or a 510K or a de novo application that lets us establish new products as predicates. The innovation in regulatory policy is also a function of leadership, and Jeff Shuren and his team have adopted modern concepts to the regulation of medical devices very efficiently. They've pioneered multi-stakeholder collaborations like the NEST program as a way to advance more new models of regulation. Along the way, Jeff Shuren has built a very strong leadership team at CDRH. I've poached some of those senior leaders from him at CDRH. The person I asked to help lead the agency as FDA's Chief of Staff, Lawrence Silvers, was previously one of Jeff's deputies. Some of those modern regulatory concepts include CDRH's focus on a benefit-risk framework that looks across the life cycle of a product. This is embodied in a series of guidance documents that the Center has issued. Another example is the use of patient preference information to support regulatory decisions, including product approvals. And still another example is a shift of pre-market data collection to the post-market setting when it comes to medical devices. This allows patients to gain faster access to life-saving devices when it's appropriate, to accept a greater uncertainty around pre-market, and to resolve that those issues will be fully vetted in a post-market setting. CDRH is also taking a refreshed and modern approach to the center's structure by piloting a total product lifecycle office. This concept breaks down review silos and takes a more holistic approach to product review and product manufacturing quality and post-market surveillance. I'll be talking more about this concept in remarks I'm giving this Friday at the National Press Club. We're also doing something similar when it comes to regulation of new drugs. Traditionally, FDA has approached products based on either the pre- or post-market status. This siloed approach doesn't fit the modern challenges that we often face. It doesn't allow our pre-market process to be as fully informed by post-market findings, and vice versa. Our post-market teams don't have as much access to the learnings gained by evaluating products as part of the pre-market process. By having our teams look at products throughout the entire life cycle, we're enhancing their understanding of products and their impact on patients. Deepening their understanding will in turn support improved application of our least burdensome approach to product reviews. I want to just close by spending the balance of my time today on another one of those modern concepts that the Device Center has pioneered. And this is the modern regulatory concept that's embodied in our new approach we're taking to digital health. We're announcing an important milestone related to this program that many of you probably already have heard about. The premise of our digital health program is the creation of a pre-market certification program called PreCert. And under this approach, FDA will become a certifier of firms seeking to go to market with digital health tools. Lower risk digital health products could be marketed without FDA pre-market review. Higher risk products could be marketed with a streamlined FDA pre-market review process. Pre-certification is used to assess, for example, whether a company consistently and reliably engages in high-quality software design and testing, and whether it has good ongoing maintenance of its software products. Employing a unique pre-certification program for software as a medical device could reduce the time and cost of market entry for digital health technologies. We previously said that the digital health pilot includes 9 companies. Today we're announcing those companies. We had 103 applicants to date, and we carefully selected the final participants in this pilot program to create a group that represents the various business models of the industry, from large tech companies and traditional medical device manufacturers to very small entrepreneurs. And so I'm pleased to announce the participants are going to be Apple, Fitbit, Google, Johnson & Johnson, Phosphorus, Roche, Samsung, Tidepool, and Verily. Our team will be spending the rest of the year working closely with these companies to deepen our understanding of their technologies and their operations and methodologies. This collaboration is a key part of establishing a proper regulatory framework. While the pilot program has been filled, the opportunity to participate and engage with FDA is still wide open. We're going to continue to look for ways to work more efficiently with other innovators throughout the pilot. Among other things, we'll be holding informational calls that are open to the public prior to the first public meeting that we have in January. We also put out a call for interested experts to come work with CDRH team for 6 months to help develop the framework as part of an Entrepreneurs in Residence program, an approach the center has already used 3 times in the past. The popularity of this pilot shows that the digital health industry is advancing, with many more traditional and non-traditional healthcare companies developing these applications. The pilot is an example of how FDA can collaborate effectively with developers so entities unfamiliar with the regulatory process can efficiently advance their technologies. This pre-cert framework is a modern approach to regulation, focusing on product developers rather than just the product, that could have other applications across our portfolio. For example, this construct could form part of the framework for a modern legislative approach to laboratory-developed tests. The bottom line is this: FDA's Device Center has been a pioneer when it comes to a growing number of concepts for more efficient and more effective regulation. I know that a lot of these ideas have depended on public and private collaboration, and so we appreciate the support of the broader medical device community in these efforts, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in these endeavors. Our goal is to make sure that the medical device industry is able to advance new innovation that can benefit patients, the kind of innovation that we heard about earlier today before our remarks, and that our regulatory process is nimble and efficient enough to enable safe, beneficial technologies to reach the market. I want to close by thanking you for the opportunity to join you for today's session. We look forward to continuing to work with you to advance FDA's mission and to achieve our vision that patients in the U.S. should have access to high-quality, safe, effective medical devices of public health importance, first in the world. Thanks a lot. I believe I'm going to be joined by Scott Whitaker, who's going to cross-examine me. Good to see you, Scott.
So thank you all for being here today, obviously, and Scott, thank you for coming all the way across the country to participate with us at this conference. It shows the importance of this industry to you and the value I think we provide to the healthcare system more broadly. I want to start off with a bit of a personal question, if it's okay. Many people know Scott's background as a doctor, a FDA commissioner, and his entire history. It's amazing, but not many people know that at a young age, Scott was also a cancer patient and a cancer survivor. While he was at FDA, I believe you were first diagnosed. Tell us a little bit about that experience, Scott, and how it impacted your life and your thinking as an FDA commissioner.
So I was diagnosed with a very early stage form of lymphoma. I had a single solitary lesion. It was actually barely palpable in my left axilla. It was a kind of tumor that only a hypochondriac doctor would have found on himself. It was stage 1A, very curable, but I underwent a very traditional chemotherapy regimen: adriamycin, bleomycin, vinblastine, dacarbazine. So it was a tough chemo regimen, 6 months of chemotherapy. I would go every other week. I would get my chemotherapy on Fridays and try to be back at work on Mondays. I think the hardest part for me wasn't the sort of physical aspects of the chemotherapy, because that was very predictable. Every time I would go for a round of chemotherapy, it was hard, and it would get incrementally hard. So it was debilitating going through that process, and each time you went through another round, the next time would be that much harder. I think the hardest part for me was the uncertainty of the diagnosis, notwithstanding the fact that I had a very curable cancer. There's still uncertainty associated with it. They tell you have a 90% chance of a cure. What about the other 10%? And so for me, what I was trying to do was figure out how to use drugs in combination, and there was still some uncertainty about how to treat early stage lymphoma of the kind I had, how to use drugs in combination to try to get that 90% up to 93%, And so I was looking for literature, I was looking for very rigorous studies. Should I use radiation, which was standard of care at the time? Should I try to use an anti-CD20 drug, because my tumor is very CD20 positive, which some people know what that means. And I opted for something that was a little bit different than what standard of care was. Now what I did has become standard of care, but I was looking to try to get 90% to 92% or 93% and also improve my ability to be cancer-free for the long run and not suffer sequelae from the treatment that I would undergo. I think that's very different. I think what I took away from that was that I was a very different patient from the patient that was told, you have a 20% chance of a 5-year cure. That's a very different situation. And that patient isn't looking for some clinical study that's going to help them figure out how to get 20% to 30%. They're looking for something potentially experimental, something that might not be approved yet, that could dramatically change their odds, because those are bad odds. And so I think that, there's a lot of different kinds of cancer patients, but I think at two ends of the spectrum, there's me, who has a very high chance of a cure and is looking for more effective ways to use existing drugs in combination, and I would never have used anything experimental. Why would I take a risk with such good odds versus someone who has a much worse outlook, and they're looking for something, early access to something. And I think that the challenge for the regulatory process is to simultaneously serve both those patients, and that's very hard, because by serving one patient, you could potentially impact the needs of the other.
Well, that's great, and we're glad you're healthy and well and in the job you're in now. We're grateful for the work you're doing. You mentioned Puerto Rico a little bit earlier in your remarks. Let's come back to that for just a minute. One of the things we wonder about is when you're hit with a storm like this, particularly in Puerto Rico, so many of our companies are hit really hard too. What can we do in two ways to prepare for that type of event and then communicate with you and the federal government about our needs relative to supply chain and a number of things that our companies will be dealing with?
I'll tell you that the situation, I think, is a lot worse than what we perceive on the news right now on the island, because it's not, the facilities themselves seem to be relatively intact, but it's a matter of getting supplies to the facilities and getting people back into the facilities. I think right now we're all setting up processes to try to deal with a more chronic process, because this is going to be a long recovery. But in the acute phase, I think trying to make sure that you're feeding up information to multiple channels. Just because you had a conversation with someone who works for the Assistant Secretary of Emergency Preparedness at HHS, you talked to someone at DHS, you made one contact. I wouldn't, if I was a company that had a critical issue, I would make sure you had that same conversation with as multiple touch points as possible, including with the FDA. And don't be shy about that. Don't think that you're banging on too many people. Because the hardest thing right now is a list of priorities is exceedingly long. And trying to figure out how you're going to prioritize fuel shipments and flights and cold chain storage and getting things in, sometimes the people who might be looking at that information don't have the right expertise. And so we want to know, DHS has been exceedingly good through this process. They have a lot of assets on the ground. HHS obviously needs to know. The hardest part is the logistics of getting things in and out right now. And the focus obviously is on the people of Puerto Rico. But I don't think, I'm not going to be shy in the coming weeks of talking about the need to also provide relief to the facilities, because what's going to be critical to the recovery of Puerto Rico is going to be getting people working again, getting the economy restarted. And the medical product manufacturing base in that island is a huge part of that economy. The vast majority of that economy is driven by that. And so Puerto Rico's economic future is dependent upon us getting these facilities restarted and not seeing companies make a decision to relocate their facilities permanently. And that would be the worst possible outcome. And that's a risk. Yeah. And so we're all very cognizant of that. I'll give one, what I'm seeing some companies do is use their facilities to provide relief directly to people as well. They're now becoming, because they have electricity, they have generators, and so they're setting up cafeteria service. And so that's bringing the workers back and helping support the families. And so I think that there are opportunities also for the industry to think about that, where it could be both beneficial to the companies because it brings people back to work, but they're also providing direct assistance to people. And if those things are going on, I've heard some of those things, we'd like to know about it, because I want to start talking about that as well, because I think it just further builds the rationale for why this is an important touch point for bringing relief to the entire island.
Okay. Let's shift to a couple policy issues real quickly. The issue of laboratory-developed tests has been an issue discussed in Washington now for 10 or 15 years. A lot of conversation in the last few years about whether a regulatory approach or a legislative approach is the best way to resolve this issue. Can you speak to that, where you are on the issue, and specifically your thoughts on regulation versus legislation?
Well, I've been around this issue a while, as have you, and we've seen an evolution in FDA's approach to this issue. When I first got to FDA in 2002, 2003, we were looking at advancing a guidance document that would have sought to apply a regulatory touch to the whole field based on a risk-based framework. We pulled back and started to focus on discrete aspects of laboratory-developed tests that we very clearly felt fell outside the CLIA framework and presented certain potential risks. Like the multivariate tests, FDA shifted back towards looking for a more comprehensive approach. I will tell you where I am right now is that I believe, having been around this issue and having tried to grapple with it through something the agency can do in guidance, I think that we are at a point where we need legislation. I think there's a better consensus among the various camps around this issue, that we could potentially get a legislative consensus, and I think that the time's right to do that. And I will fully admit, I am working very hard towards that goal. I am going to be having conversations, and have had conversations on Capitol Hill around these issues. I'm going to continue to speak out publicly. I think that if we don't get something done in the near term, and there's a vehicle that we could do this on, we have some user fee legislation passing in a year, and there's going to be the OTC user fee and the ADUFA, the Animal Drug User Fee Bill, is going to be passing at some point. FDA legislation has been broadly bipartisan historically. I think we have the opportunity to work on a framework for the appropriate regulation of LDT tests for the long run as part of that legislative vehicle. And my view is it would be a missed opportunity not to do it. I think, the industry sort of, and I don't want to be cynical, but there was a little bit of, let's try to get a few more years in the framework we have, and that worked for a while. But I think that the level of complexity and risk in some of these tests, the public health issues that are inherent, the issues around reimbursement are very acute. I think the time has come that this is now a mature industry. This is not an industry where FDA can just continue to exercise enforcement discretion because it's a mom and pop industry and it's a bunch of small operators. This is a vast industry, and we're not going to be able to step away from it in the long run. And I think the right way to approach it is through legislation.
Another issue that's captured the country recently is the opioid crisis. And I know you've been on the front edge of that conversation. In this room, you have companies who do so much in the pain management space. You saw some of the stories about our companies in the past. What can we do, from your perspective, to help solve some of the issues around the opioid crisis right now?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity for medical device alternatives to systemic therapy for opioids, and I talked about that in my confirmation hearing. I continue to talk about that. We are thinking about how we could create a framework inside FDA that allows for the evaluation of medical devices that can deliver local therapy for pain syndromes, in the context of thinking also about systemic therapy, and in the context of thinking about risk-benefit to pain management overall, because there's a lot of settings in which a medical device alternative is viewed a certain way, but when viewed against the medicinal alternative, systemic therapy, the profile of that product could look vastly different. It could look vastly more safe if the alternative is systemic therapy. And so among the things that we've talked about is trying to create something like a pain center to start to think about cross-center policy making around the development of products for pain generally, similar to what we've tried to do on the oncology side, where we've created an oncology center for excellence. I'm not sure, we're still in sort of early phases of talking about this, and so we have to work out what discrete issues it would address. But I do think that it's important for us to think about medical device technology, not just in the context of other medical devices, but also in the context of the ability for a medical device that could deliver, localized therapy or a patch or something like that that could treat a discrete area of pain against the alternative, which is increasingly systemic therapy and drugs that have addictive potential.
On the regulatory front at FDA, we've made a lot of progress legislatively. We passed a cures legislation a year or so ago. This year we passed PDUFA, which is a really important landmark piece of legislation, I think, as well. Can you reflect on both of those two pieces of legislation, maybe particularly talk about cures and least burdensome requirements that are in there and what FDA is doing to help begin to implement that?
Well, I've said that I think that this was a great time to be coming into FDA for a variety of reasons. One of them was the recently enacted legislation. That's an incredible template and tailwind to come into the agency with both the user fee acts reauthorized as well as the cures legislation. And we are immensely grateful for the support and collaboration that we had through the user fee process. It provides obviously very important resources for the agency. I think that the cures is a very important vehicle, because it's not just the things that are embedded in cures, and you talk about least burdensome, and we're continuing to work through the implementation of that. And I know Jeff has embodied that element in a lot of different things that we're doing across the center. But the value of cures, even beyond the discrete things that are in the legislation, is also cures as a template upon which we could embed other policy. And so the ability to build around the cures initiatives with other policy efforts that are very related to cures but might not have been explicitly prescribed in cures becomes very seductive. It's a very useful vehicle for driving things where we have an expression of congressional intent, and it's not just the agency trying to define policy on its own, but we're following the intent of Congress and what they laid out in cures. And so I think you're going to see the focus on cures. Obviously the implementation is being done at the center level and being driven at the center level, but there's a lot of policy focus on cures at my level as well for that purpose, that I want to make sure that we're not only implementing the provisions in cures efficiently and effectively and following the spirit of what Congress intended, but we're looking for opportunities to embed other policy priorities in aspects of how we roll out the cures provisions.
So you've been on the job at FDA now for just about 5 months. If you reflect back on when you came into the position and you look at the challenges you knew you would inherit compared to the challenges that you have once you got there, is there one thing that stands out that has surprised you most about the job, and if so, what is that?
Oh, it reminds me of so when I first got there, I had a conversation with Mark McClellan, who brought me into all this many years ago. I started my government career as a senior advisor to him, and he called me up and he said, "So how is it?" I said, "Well, Mark, it's a lot harder than when you did it." And he didn't. I'm not sure that's exactly what he wanted to hear. And he's like, "No, it's the same. You just didn't know how hard it was for me." But I think it's not a matter of being harder or easier. I think that the scope of the FDA has changed a lot, and it was evidenced to me by when I walked into the commissioner's office, and just the structure of the commissioner's office. It was a lot bigger than when I remembered it. I mean, Mark operated a commissioner's office with a handful of senior advisors like me in a very, very small structure, and I inherited a large structure. But it's an agency that now has tobacco as part of its mandate. But even when you look across the different centers, we now have biosimilars. We have things that just didn't exist before. We have gene and cell therapy. Back when I was at the FDA last time, those were early stage theoretical concepts, and now we have products that we're reviewing and approving. So the scope of it has changed a lot. We have a lot of extraterritorial jurisdiction now with the new food authorities, FDASIA, FSMA. So it's a much bigger agency with a lot more risk on a daily basis. And I think the biggest challenge, from my standpoint, is trying to look across the FDA's entire portfolio and making sure that I'm focused on the critical issues across that entire portfolio. Because you don't want to just focus on drugs or medical devices or food issues. You've really got to be focused on the full scope of FDA's portfolio. And truth be told, if I was to probably amortize my time that I've spent since I've been on the job, it would probably be the case that I've spent the most time on tobacco, and that would probably surprise people. Yeah. So it really is a situation where I think that the scope of the agency has gotten very, very big over the last 15 years.
Well, I can speak, I think, for the entire industry. Where we were 5 years ago at the FDA compared to where we are today, it's night and day. And I think your leadership, along with the leadership of Jeff and his team, have made a huge difference in the lives of patients and the lives of these companies who are trying to create products to help folks, and we are really grateful for that. An editorial comment I would add, we would hope that at some point CMS would learn the lessons from your leadership at FDA and what has been done there to create a more friendly environment for us to operate with them. I won't ask you to comment on that today, but it is the next era of issues with the federal government, I think, that we need to work on. So I want to close with one final question. And many people don't know something about Scott, but it's really important to him. He's not only a doctor, as I said, and a cancer survivor, he's also a chicken farmer. And very few people are aware of this. I think you have an urban flock, is that what they call them?
Backyard chickens.
What also I heard recently is you've lost one recently, is that right?
Well, this has been a source of controversy for those who are on Twitter. I testified before Congress that I had 7 chickens, and then I spoke a couple of weeks later that I had 8. And so what happened was I had 7 chickens. I unfortunately lost one to old age. Then I bought 2 new ones, so that's 7 minus 1 plus 2 is 8. And then I spoke again recently. I said I have 7 again because I lost another one. So I had a cohort that were 4 years old or 5 years old, so they're now coming up on their life expectancy. So it's been a source of controversy in Washington whether I misspoke before Congress, but I figure I'll just set the record straight here. The other thing I'll say about my chickens is, and I'm not saying that they're not regulated by FDA, so I'm not trying to obviate regulation, but they're very well treated, and I think that I have electricity going out there, they have heating pads in the winter, they have a roof, and I wrap it in plastic in the winter to shelter them from the storm, and we think that my fully loaded cost per egg is probably about $4 or $5.
So who would have thought? This New York City doctor, who's now the FDA Commissioner, down deep inside, he's just a simple chicken farmer. Scott, we appreciate your time. Thanks for making the trip across country and for your leadership at the FDA.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.